Hello and welcome to the FinanceSmartz Entrepreneurship Series. Here is our host, Arul Nigam.
Welcome back to the FinanceSmartz Entrepreneurship Series. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ms. Kristine Ashcraft, who serves as the head of Pharmacogenomics at Invitae. Ms. Ashcraft's medical technology company, YouScript, was acquired by Invitae in April of this year. Welcome, Ms. Ashcraft. So just to begin, could you please outline your career path and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So I started my undergraduate degree, was a molecular biology undergrad. I did want to go into genetics. I lost my grandmother to cancer when I was in high school and really thought I wanted to do something to help diagnose and fix cancer. And I thought genetics was some very interesting technology, but I got my undergrad and was applying to graduate schools at first. And then I realized, I don't actually like being in a lab that much, even though I find the science absolutely fascinating. Right. Maybe I ought not be going on for a PhD right now. So I left with my undergraduate degree and actually started my career in nonprofit for a year or so. And then I ended up getting a position for a few years running an insurance call center of all things. So wasn't utilizing my skills per se at all, but did have, I think, some sales capabilities that I developed during that time. And then in 2000, a company called Genelex was hiring in Seattle. Genelex was actually a pioneer in genetics. The company was originally formed in 1987 as one of the first forensic crime labs in the country with a National Institute of Justice grant. Wow. And so I joined in 2000 and was originally in charge of the call center. So actually using my sales skills in my degree area, which was fun. But just continued advancing with that company. So went from call center manager to director of sales and marketing. And then I noticed that, like myself, virtually everybody at the company, although our ideas were wonderful, we weren't really scaling as much as I thought we should be based on how big of an impact our technology could have. And so I approached the co-founders, who were CEO and chief scientific officer at the company, and said, hey, I want to get my MBA. I found a program that enables me to work full-time and get my MBA at Babson. And they have this great program where they actually fly teachers out to Portland, Oregon, which isn't very far away from me. And you can do this kind of hybrid online in-person model that would work. And I said, go for it. And so about 10 years ago now, I got my MBA while working full time, which was hard. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It's definitely a tough 2 years. Yeah. But I think it really gave me a business perspective that I had been missing before. Right. That was very interesting. I did get my MBA in entrepreneurship specifically, and then came back with a lot of ideas. They made me COO. And then CEO. And then I actually ended up spinning YouScript, which was a clinical decision support tool, the software, out of the lab as its own entity, because I realized that it was very hard to scale that technology when there was these competing lab versus software investment and priority issues. So spun it out and learned a lot very quickly about what it's like to run a startup. So an interesting journey there. And then more recently, in April of this year, both the lab I spun YouScript out of and YouScript were acquired by Invitae right at the start of the pandemic. So been an interesting ride.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So just as question sort of out of that, did you ever plan to become an entrepreneur before, or did you really have come to that decision when you realized your team wasn't scaling as fast as you expected it should have?
Yeah, I don't think that when I was in grade school or middle school or high school, even, I was like, you know what, I'm going to be an entrepreneur when I grow up. I don't think that was the path that I envisioned. I did always envision a path where I would contribute to benefit humanity. I was a military brat. So I went to 17 schools, 17 years, 5 countries, 7 states. We would buy houses and remodel them and flip them as I was growing up. And I think I was just raised very much with, if you see a problem, you go and fix it. And so I definitely had that mentality, but I never was like, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur when I grow up. I definitely learned that was something that I should be doing over time.
So once you made that decision to become an entrepreneur and work on scaling the work that your team was doing, what were the early challenges that you faced and obstacles, and how did you overcome those? And I guess along with that, when you first started, what were your biggest fears and what did you do to manage and mitigate those?
Yeah. So when we first spun out, we're lucky enough, a friend of a friend had a very generous and smart businessman that was willing to be our lead angel investor, that made everything happen. But of course, he couldn't single-handedly keep the company going. So I had to figure out how to raise additional funds, because especially in healthcare, there's often a pretty long gap between being profitable and getting started. There's a lot of additional layers of things you need to do to actually get to a point where you will be profitable. And so learning how to actually raise money. I will say we stared death in the face a number of times, which is not uncommon for startups. Where are we going to get the money from to cover payroll and rent in not very many weeks from now? And so had to figure out creative ways to overcome that. Sometimes it was, hey, let's do a friends and family round, which actually kept us going for quite some time. Creative things where you would reach out to customers and be like, hey, we'll give you a discount if you pay early. Right. So you have to get very creative. So I think that the biggest, fear was the concern that maybe you wouldn't be able to pull it off, and it kept happening and you would pull it off. So it's this kind of tightrope walk between optimism and, oh my goodness, this is rather scary. I'd say some of the things that I did to help deal with that, though, I was lucky enough to be accepted into a program called Springboard. That is a nonprofit that was created to help specifically women-led companies get venture financing, get access to networks, potential partners, and customers. And that was incredibly helpful. And, even if you're not a female in that particular one wouldn't help you, there are a lot of different organizations that help in different areas. And I think finding a network and tapping into one that can really help you is a definite need. I also joined a women's CEO group in Seattle, so I could just sit and powwow with other CEOs that were dealing with similar issues with their startups, and having that sounding board, as well as it was run by somebody who'd been there and done it with several companies, was really, really very helpful. And I'd say the other thing, and I can't say I was great about it always, but I try to do yoga every week, and when you're grinding, it's easy to forget to take care of yourself and make sure you have a work-life balance, but it's even more important than ever.
That makes sense. And I guess since you brought up the financing, I think that's probably like a pretty common challenge that startups face. So the point that you made about taking advantage of things like Springboard and like grant programs, I think can probably be really helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, the lessons learned, if I had it to do over again, I probably would have done a better job of other people's money. So getting grants or small business innovation research, things that would help move the company along that didn't actually require a percentage of ownership in the company. I'd say the other thing is there are a lot of great incubator programs, and I was a bit late to the game, and it was a spin-off of technology. But if somebody were starting something from the gate, I did come across a lot of great incubator programs where they would enable you to test drive, talk to people about your idea, help refine it, maybe find a first customer. And so there's some really great programs that help walk people through all those different steps that I think are definitely worth looking into.
That makes sense. You a few minutes ago, you also brought up that especially in healthcare, there's usually a pretty large gap between when you start and when you finally become profitable. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And also, I guess, since in healthcare, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles and a lengthy approval process. So could you talk a bit more about what it's like to deal with that as a startup and as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think that I have had the opportunity to sell in other areas, and it was a lot easier. Your value proposition is huge. We save lives, we save money. This seems logical. You should invest in it. But for us particularly, we were selling clinical decision support tools that integrated into the electronic health record that doctors use at large health systems. And there are a lot of different decision makers involved in that, and a lot of competing priorities. Even if they think it's the best thing since sliced bread, they may have 12 things they have to get done before they get to do anything they think should be done. And so it's tough there. And then you have the added layer of, depending on what your offering is, how is this regulated? And it's going to be much more heavily regulated than a lot of other things somebody could go into as an entrepreneur. So what does the FDA do in this particular space? Am I a medical device? Do I have to go through that kind of clearance, which would require clinical studies that are expensive? You typically have to fund those yourself, or, perhaps you can get grants. But it's a very lengthy process between where you're going and where you need to be, or where you are and where you need to be. I'm trying to remember the name. I just read a book, and it was one of the chapters was literally, you have to fail 2 times before anything ever happens. And so they interviewed a ton of actually successful entrepreneurs, and they were like, oh yeah, we thought we were at the end 2 times before we finally came out on the other side. Right. So yeah,
that makes sense. And speaking of entrepreneurship in the medical field, in general, I guess especially with research, in medical research, cooperation is obviously very important, but in entrepreneurship, competition is also critical. So what is it like to balance cooperation and competition as an entrepreneur in medicine?
I think one of the advantages of entrepreneurship in medicine is, at least in the start, there's not a lot of direct competition. If you have a truly unique idea. Clearly there's some competition there. I would say, though, if you're going after a new market, my general belief has always been, if the ocean rises, all boats rise. Nobody's going to be able to own the entire global market in anything, or that's monopoly and it's illegal. So I think that there are also creative ways where sometimes you have frenemies, where maybe you compete directly in one area, but you actually could work together on something in another area. One of the other things in healthcare, in my particular field, a lot of people in the pharmacogenomics community have banded together to really help show what quality looks like, so that regulating agencies understand what can be trusted and what can't from a scientific standpoint. So it behooves everybody that works in that industry to help make sure that people understand what good science looks like and what they can depend on and what they can't. And so there are certainly times where banding together makes a ton of sense. I would say one thing that's tough, especially if you're on the venture capital raise market. I remember once I was doing a pitch competition in Seattle, and I'm staring directly at a competitor that came to the pitch contest. I was like, oh, well, I'm sharing my secrets, so to speak. But at the end of the day, even if you're sharing a high level secret, It all comes down to, I think, execution, building a good culture and a good team. So, even from a competitive side, I think the main thing is to make sure you understand your why and make sure your team has the same why, and then things tend to work out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now I'd kind of like to transition to another topic that you brought up before. So your company, YouScript, was spun off originally and then acquired. So could you talk a little bit about both of those processes and maybe the challenges associated with each of those, and what dealing with that is like as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so the Spinout was interesting. So you're essentially taking what was once one company and splitting it into two. We originally tried to do that under the same roof. And it was just very hard because people fell into the standard habits of, hey, even though you're paid by a different company to do different things, I'm still going to ask things of you, even though I work for a different company. So I'm like, we're going to have to get our own place. So we literally had to leave in order to establish our own culture and kind of make that separation. And I think that was more of a, how do you tease apart these two companies and make sure everybody, nothing breaks in the process, because we still wanted to support the mothership, so to speak. And then when we were both acquired, I would say, wow, that's a long process. So you sign an agreement that you think you're going to go forward with this, and then they request literally piles and piles and piles of information to be put in a data room. And so, it's very careful and very important to invest in, a good startup lawyer, accountant, et cetera, from the beginning. So it's a lot easier to create that data if that does happen. And the same is going to be true if you do venture finance they're going to ask for a lot of data. So you want to put in the right framework from the beginning, so it's easy for you to provide your quarterly financials in great detail and lists of all your customers and leads and your patent portfolio. Like, all of that needs to be ready to share. And there's a lot of legal steps. I mean, I had to contact every single one of our investors. But I mean, it's worth it, but I would say it was a lot more work. And that the more you can do to make sure you have very, very organized details on everything, if that's the path that you're planning on taking, the better off you're going to be when it comes to fruition, because it's a lot. Yeah.
That makes sense. And so how do you, as an entrepreneur, how do you make the decision to spin off or to go forward with acquisition? Like, what are the signs that someone should look for to know that it's the right decision for their company?
Yeah. So I think that the reason that we spun off is that I realized there needed to be investment in and a team dedicated to just the software.
Yeah.
And the software that's customer was large health systems that were going to be integrated in their electronic health record system. The lab we spun out of was mainly designed to push lab testing to doctors or clinics. So do you have a different target customer that has different needs? Do you have, different needs in terms of hires? So we had some software development, engineering, et cetera, expertise in the lab, but the lab always won in terms of investing in hires because it was the cash cow, right? And so it made sense to spin out so there could be more focus on this new customer that was being served. And I think, for us, that made the most sense. Sometimes that's just a kind of semi-autonomous unit of a larger company. A lot of large companies have these kind of innovation offshoots. So it doesn't always have to be a complete spin out. In terms of when is it time, we were actually looking to close a venture capital round, and we're pretty close to doing that when the acquisition came up as a potential option. And I think really the thought process there is, does this align with what you're trying to do? Do you think this will, do the cultures align? Do you think it will help you get where you want to go faster, easier? And so I think that the stars aligned, you're going to, one of the other things, make sure you have a great board of directors and a great team, but, go to the board of directors that you put in place and ask their opinion. Does this make sense? What is the best path forward in terms of the offer on the table? So I can't say it's an easy decision. You do have to weigh a lot of pros and cons, but if you have good advisors in place, as well as, a real thought on what is the long-term vision, and is this going to help achieve that?
I see. So I guess ultimately it really just comes down to, and this makes sense, but how well would spinning off or getting acquired serve the company's mission? And so you make that decision with as much advice from your team as possible.
Correct. Way to summarize well.
Thank you. So as you mentioned before, your company was acquired early on in the pandemic, when there was a lot of, or at least it was finalized at that point. When there was a lot of uncertainty in general in the market. So could you just talk a little bit about what it's been like to navigate through the pandemic, and how has the lessons that you've learned conducting business now, how will that affect the way you operate your company going forward?
It's interesting. I was thinking back when we got some additional office space in Seattle a while ago. One of the questions that we put out was, do we actually need an office space? Like, maybe we should work remotely and just have occasional conference rooms that we rent, or meet XYZ when we actually need more strategy whiteboard team meetings where in-person makes more sense. And we talked about it and chose not to go that route. I think if I had that same conversation after COVID, I probably would go that route. And so I think myself and a lot of people have learned about the ability of remote work to be a lot more, it works most of the time. There are definitely instances where you need in person, but especially for a startup that's trying to be getting by on less resources, not having to pay a monthly payment on an office building is a big savings, right? Yeah. Giving people an allowance for IT instead of propping up all that infrastructure can make sense, depending clearly on how much in-person versus external work is needed. So that was one. I think that it's certainly been challenging becoming part of a larger company in the middle of a pandemic when you mainly only work remotely. So would have been nice to have some in-persons, in there that COVID hasn't allowed. But I think one thing that Invitae did really well was move to telehealth as well. So enabling our customers to reach their patients and, mail kits. So enabling that kind of external access as much as possible to their healthcare providers and partnering with them to do that. So I know there's different applications in different areas, but, taking a step back and going, okay, how do we make it easier for the people that we serve or the customer that we serve to move them in the direction we need to? Like, how can we leverage technology or our services to make it easier for them to operate under these new constraints?
So maybe it actually accelerated the adoption of some of your company's products.
Yeah, I mean, for Invitae, we've definitely seen a huge increase in use of our we have a chatbot, a genetic information assistant, that say your doctor wants to make sure you have had all the genetic screening you need for hereditary cancer. In order to determine if that is necessary, they do a little family history. So, hey, did your mother have cancer? Did your father, your grandmother, grandfather, what kind, what age? And track through. And depending on how you answer that, you may need cancer genetic screening according to like NCCN. And so you can do all that remotely. You can send somebody an app on their phone that's like, hey, your doctor would like to have these questions answered, and then you can do the doctor can then do a telehealth visit instead of an in-person visit, and then a swab kit can be mailed to the patient's home. So, how can you facilitate that more virtual care? But yeah,
that's really interesting. Just on the topic of COVID, I had one more question. Something we've heard a lot about is that with the adoption of more work from home, in theory, companies will be able to draw on more talent from across the country or even across the world. And since so much of your work is in technology, obviously, ultimately it's medical, but since so much of it relies on technology, is that something you've actually something you've seen in reality, or is that more just people?
I think that, Invitae, from its start, and this had nothing to do with me, this was the vision of the founders of Invitae, but they always wanted to enable a workforce that could work from anywhere. Clearly, if they're lab tech, they need to be physically in the lab. You can't. But for most positions, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of where you need to be in the world. And so they created, tools to engage with the company that, could be used from anywhere. And we have team members all over the world. And I think that that's going to be an advantage, especially I think that, the generations coming out today, my stepdaughter just graduated from college earlier this year. And I think that, people are more and more driven, I think, for the desire to make a difference, and not just the desire to make a ton of money, and a desire to have a work-life balance. And so enabling that, if your desire is to live in Costa Rica because you're a big surfer, but you also want to work for a great company and, code by day, there's nothing that really ought to prevent you from doing that. I remember seeing a interview once, or a video they played at the beginning of an IT conference every year. And it was like, India has more honor students than the US has students. Like, to not take advantage of talent in different parts of the world is not bright from a, how do we do what we can do to advance this kind of position.
I see. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, even post-COVID, when how much people will stick to the current work from home setup versus how much they'll revert back. So just one final question. If you could go back to the beginning of your career and tell yourself, or maybe one of the viewers who could be a new or aspiring entrepreneur, what advice would you give yourself?
It's a great question. So if I could go back, to the beginning of my entrepreneurial career, I think the biggest advice would really be to take advantage of an incubator program in the specific sector you're most interested in. So healthcare has a ton by area, like Texas Medical, for example. I think non-COVID, you go live there for a couple months, and they iterate through all of the different things that you're going to need to think through to see if this will scale. I would highly encourage anyone that has the time or wherewithal and really wants to pursue something. An MBA is hard, but it is certainly worth it. I mean, I can only speak to the Babson MBA program in entrepreneurship, but it gave me a well-rounded ability to think about questions from the finance angle, which I never thought about before, and the marketing angle, and the economics, and larger macroeconomics angle. And so depending on what you're wanting to do, that can be incredibly helpful.
I see. So doing what you can to early on to immerse yourself in an environment where you can gain exposure to the areas that are most likely to pose challenges and that are the most important for making sure you can serve your mission going forward.
Agreed. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And I think that all the advice you gave is going to be really helpful, I think, for me and definitely for all of our viewers. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and good luck. I hope you go change the world, you and whoever else is listening to this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.